Good morning, everyone. You're all muted, so assume that, hey.
Good morning. Good morning.
How's it going?
Going.
It's going. It's gonna keep going like this for a while too. I don't think it's gonna stop,
Nope.
Not anytime soon anyways.
You think we'll be like this in the fall?
I don't know. They've already made it like this for summer school. I think it'll matter. I think it'll depend on infection rates and if those start slowing down. Because like right now, I think we've hit 5,000 deaths in the U.S. I read that this morning, with something like 1 million global cases at the moment. And so I think that if it starts slowing down, I think maybe by the fall we'll be back in class. I like to be optimistic, so if I want to say something, I'm going to say, yeah, sure, by the fall we'll be in class. I think the other concern is at some point you just have to have continuity of life, like and trying to figure out like what that balance is. And I think right now it makes sense to like, hey, everybody stay home. We can do this. We've already, we've been doing it for a little bit. But I think trying to figure out what happens later. It's the same way with like, we had a faculty meeting yesterday and we were all talking about at what point, like students, okay, like over the summer and like, that's to reduce the number of people coming, but at what point, do we keep working from home until next semester? I don't know either. And like we have conferences. I keep getting emails about these conferences that we normally have over the summer and they're like, yeah, we're still planning them. And you're like, I can't go get a travel approval right now. So it's like I can't book my conference because I can't get approval to travel. So I don't know. I guess we'll figure it out. That's my story. Is this almost everybody? Let's see, 3, 6. I think that's almost everybody. I have this thing where I think it's going to record my whole screen, and so there's no way just to make my little space bigger. Anyways, okay, so let's do some housekeeping. So anybody who hasn't sent me your paper, your draft or your outline, if you'll send that to me after class, that would be great. The reason there's nothing, just email it to me, which is what I've been telling y'all to do. The reason there's nothing online is because it's part of your project grade, and so I'm just going to record that you turn something in, and it's not being graded. It's more of like a pass-fail thing. Did you do something or not? Because the aim of it was to during the semester to be like, hey, we all check in with each other and say like, are you doing something for your project? I still have not put something up about changing. Let me take a note to myself. Change exam date for 4/20. So I haven't changed the exam date online, but we are going to do that final exam the last day of class rather than on finals day, because we were intended to do presentations those last few classes, and so we can play that by ear, but we'll do the exam the last day of class instead of make you take a test on exam period days. You're not coming in class. You're not coming to campus anyway, so might as well do it whenever, wherever. God will be together. I'll be there. You'll be here. Oh, there's a chit chat. No, Justin, we will not be presenting. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to just no presentations. I mean, I like presentations are good. They give us a lot of good practice and a lot of good skills in life. Presenting over Zoom is weird, and I think for the kind of trying to get it, we already run into timing issues during a regular class, and I think adding in an online environment I think will make it harder. If you want to all present, I mean we can make it happen. We'll just have to end up extending class a little bit. But I think when we took the vote last time, everybody was pretty strongly in favor of doing the exam the last day and no presentations. So you feel very strongly about wanting to present, Justin, because I'm sure you're just dying to do it. You can email your peers and you all can write a petition to why you should do presentations again. I'm happy to hear. I mean, I like listen to, part of the value of the presentation is also to get you to speak into, talk about your countries. And I was excited to hear from you about your countries, because I learned things too. Anyways, okay, so presentations, you're getting me your draft of something. Was that all the housekeeping things? Anything else that we need to touch base on that I have not thought of? Nope, not.
So
Yeah,
what day will the paper be?
What did you say, Christina?
I said, so what day will the paper be due?
That's a good question. I would say the last day of class, but that puts me grading your papers and your exams at the same time, and that's going to be really intense. Can we do your papers due the second to last day of class? Tonks, we're not going outside right now. Sorry, my dog like wants to go outside because she's like, it's sunny. Let's go outside. And
If
so,
you need to cancel class to take Tonks outside, I'm sure.
you know, I think she'll be fine. She'll be fine. We'll go for a WALK after this lecture. She's just getting antsy. So yeah, so I don't know what day that is. The second to last day of class. Let me look at a calendar real fast. That was your final. So your final will be the 23rd. Your papers will be to the 21st. Let me write this down. Papers due 21st of April. Final 23rd. Are there any reasons why that should be contested in some way? Nope. Okay, great. So papers will be due the 21st by 5 o'clock. They don't have to be done by class, 5 o'clock, 5 p.m. I'll throw another announcement out there. I feel like I'm making announcements out the wazoo to you guys, and you're going to stop reading them because you're like, I'm tired of getting all of these things. I try to delete the old ones, but there's one that's like the big long online one, and so I don't want to. I don't know. So I'm sorry they had to keep bombarding with all these announcements. So there's that. Justin, did you have another question?
I don't think so. I think I was just going to ask, like, for the thing that we're sitting today is just like evidence that we've started on it. Like, it's not like a finished draft, right?
No, not at all. So
Cool.
And I think you had hopped off before somebody had followed up with the question at the end of last class. It is either I will take an outline that you like have an idea of what you're going to talk about in your entire paper, and that's fine. I've had somebody had started a draft and sent me the first few paragraphs. Other people kind of filled in with data that they're going to add into it and some sources. The intention is just to make sure that you're making some kind of progress, and I want to see that you're doing something. So I know it's a little Wing Chun about the expectations. So anything else before we start class? I mean, we started class, but start like class. Olivia, were you just like throwing your hand out there, like stretching your arms, or didn't know if you're like, holla at me, pick me? No? Okay. Let me share my screen and we will start doing something. Gotta get my iPad up and ready here. Share screen. Zoom. Oh, there, Kayla sent me something too. Sorry, I got my notifications on my screen here. Okay, so we're coming back into where we were last class. I guess I could have put all of the notes in the same thing. We started on political economy on Tuesday, and so we started talking about what is political economy.
It's the interaction between the economic system and the political system.
Yeah, so it's some kind of interaction between economics and politics. And we start talking about this is because this whole point we've talked up until this moment is we've talked about kind of the economic rationale between of trade. We've said here's theoretically why certain countries should produce certain goods and how that trades those goods should trade and those flows move. And so we're getting now into the governance behind it. And so we start talking about GATT, which is the what? Somebody other than Christina answer this. Not that I don't like your answers, Christina, just forcing other people to talk to me.
The general agreement on trade.
Yes, thank you, Riley and Mary Lynn, for the team effort. It is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. It was signed in 1947. We said it had a few general principles, like non-discrimination, that that goods were going to be treated as equivalencies, that we were going to try to get rid of quotas, or that we were going to try to get rid of non-tariff trade barriers, and that there was some kind of allowance for provisions for low-income countries. We said that there was kind of these main issues of GATT. One of the things, and we talked about, is its escape clause. So this is where we're going to pick up today. So the WTO, or the GATT, we're going to get into how GATT became WTO in a second, it has these rounds. And so what it was is they, and you'll see that, I think, whenever, if you're looking at whether your country is part of the WTO and what, and whether they, you'll end up seeing a round, typically probably the Uruguay round or the Doha round. I think I saw something in one of your outlines about the Bali package. What happens is that there was this, okay, we all agreed to GATT. We had 23 different countries that said, yeah, let's create these blocks of trade where we're all going to agree to free trade, and we're going to have all of these provisions between our countries. And then what happened, so that was in 1947, and then we had these different rounds. And so I'm not going to go over all the rounds. There's been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's been 9 rounds of the of GATT trade rounds. And basically what they did was they came back to the table and said, hey, let's talk about where we are, where we need to go, what kind of renegotiations do we need to do, because there's always a changing environment, right? There's always things that are changing. So if we took think about, let's relate it to something different. So like the US ag policy, we don't want to default to ag policy from 1929, because our ag looks vastly different than we did produce in 1929. And so which is why we want the Farm Bill to continue to change, because if we don't vote on a Farm Bill, it defaults to like the Farm Bill of the 1920s, which is not so good for us in today's production, because we produce a lot of things. We're producing hemp now, right? Like we're producing, there's marijuana policy. I mean, there's so many different policies that affect today. And so the same thing happened in trade. What happened was we came back and we added more countries, and then we had to have more discussions about that. We added more countries. We had to have more discussions about that. There was a Geneva Act in 1956, and it led to $2.5 billion worth of trade restrictions. I mean, so there's just this continuously trade. I'm not going to go over all of these, because not that they're not important, they're just, it's not, I think we're going to skip ahead. And so, and they're all lasting different amounts of time. But so I'm going to, so there was, we're going to talk about the Uruguay round. But so let's say, for instance, like the Tokyo round was in 1973 and lasted 74 months. So when we're talking about these rounds, when they first started, they're lasting like 6 months, right? So because you have 23 countries, and they basically can come to an agreement pretty quickly. In the Tokyo round, we're up to 102 countries. So during the Geneva round, which is creation of the GATT, right, signing of GATT, had 23 countries, and it lasted 7 months. By Tokyo in 1973, it's 74 months and it's 102 countries. And the reason why it's lasting 74 months is because it's 102 countries. And so now you have to have 102 countries agree to de-tariffication, to agree to trade reductions. Tokyo reduced, it was tariff reductions more than 300 billion. That's US dollars, globally, so it's not just the US. And so what we have is this kind of tariff reductions by more than 300 billion happening. And so it's a pretty, so we're moving, because you think like what we started from, and I have a chart later on, let me talk about it, but tariff rates in 1913, on average for the US was 32%. It was a 32% tariff rate. And this is on a whole bunch of different types of products. It's not like only all products are 32%. And then, for instance, Italy was 17%. You skip forward to 1952, the US is 9%, Italy is at 24%, and then in 2007, the averages are down to 3 to 5%. And so that change in tariffication happened because of these different rounds, but it also took a lot of negotiation to get to those points, because we don't like to concede things if we can, protect them in some way. And so we had this Tokyo round. You know, previously the Kennedy round was previous to that and was the anti-dumping round. So let's fast forward to the really fancy one. And this is called the Uruguay round. Uruguay round. And you'll read a lot about this in most of your countries. I imagine if you're going to be talking about the WTO and then kind of international trade governance, because the WTO, the Uruguay round started in 1986, the year I was born, if y'all want to know. It started and it lasted 87 months. 87 months. That's ridiculous. And part of that was because we now have 123 countries for the Uruguay round. So again, we're just starting to expand the number of people coming to the table, the number of types of concessions, because every little thing is argued about, right? Like, should we have policies on sugar beets? And should we fight for those policies on sugar beets? And why are we going to protect those? And we have to justify why we're protecting sugar beets over, you know, and if they're not trade distorting policies. And if they are trade distorting policies, how are we going to justify that? Hey, my mom's telling me something.
When you have like that dollar value, is that $300 billion in like actual tariff dollars or tariffs on $300 billion of goods?
No, that's tariff dollars. Like that's $300 billion worth of like tariff reductions.
Okay.
So we're kind of allowing for that trade to flow.
Cool. Is that big? Like that just sounds really small when you talk about like
all of the countries. Yeah.
Of like, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not super large when we think about it. So it's a big number in general, right? Like and for a lot of countries that might be, you know, a substantial amount of their GDP on an annual basis, right?
Yeah.
But if we're thinking about like the US, right? Like that's not going to be, you know, Hillshire Farms was at one point we were $20 billion company, right? So like when we think about like the size of what we produced as hot dogs and hot dogs and sausages, and tea and coffee and stuff at the time. But by that round, the U.S. has made a lot of concessions by this point. And so those concessions are really typical, and I don't have it written out, and I don't know exactly what countries were making those concessions. I'm going to guess that they were probably more in converting, it's called tariffication, we'll talk about it in a minute. It's in converting non-tariff trade barriers into tariff trade barriers and then trying to reduce those, because this was the amount of trade that was not happening because people were putting up non-tariff trade barriers. And so to your point, is that a big number? I mean, it's big to me. Heck yeah, I'd take $300 billion real quick. But in the scheme of like how much each of these countries are exporting, probably not. But we don't have the breakout between who's making those concessions the most. You didn't actually ask the question. I just keep talking. Is that all? Do you have any more comments, Justin?
No, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. So we have 123 countries. The big deal for the Uruguay round is that it led to the creation of the WTO, or the World Trade Organization, WTO. And so we're going to talk a lot about the WTO in the next little bit. That's what we're feeding into, because basically the WTO replaces GATT. So it doesn't say GATT is stupid. It says, hey, let's build on what GATT has created, and we're actually going to create this new organization to be able to have some kind of governance on these trade. And so, I will read the next slide. I'm going to finish with these rounds, and then we're going to go into the WTO. So know that WTO is where we're going. So the big deal with the Uruguay round was that so many things going through. I should probably figure out how to make no notification show up on my iPad. That's a goal I should make for myself. Anyways, so what we have is this the Uruguay round. We have these different non-tariff creation of the World WTO. We also move into looking at rules for intellectual property. We look for, it focused on ag. So ag was a big focus. As were textiles, which you could argue is part of ag, right? Like what are textiles? Cotton, some kind of fiber developed. It is a type of agriculture. And moving into non-tariff measures. And we're condensing, right, 87 months of negotiations into like, oh, here's 4 lines of what it did. It created the WTO. It did this. It did, but the idea behind this is that we have this massive amount of overhaul of what GATT was. Because up until this point, and we talked about it yesterday a little bit, was that GATT said, hey, you can't do all of these things, but we didn't have any way to enforce it. Right? Is it didn't have any kind of enforcement policy behind it. I'm going to quickly tell you that we are currently, I'm going to skip down here. We're currently on the Doha round. And this started, any indication, in 2001 started. We're 159 countries. And again, it focuses on ag, labor standards, competition, transparency. So this idea that we can't, we don't get to play by ourselves anymore and just only get to share things. So like some of the argument is like this transparency between countries about trade issues, about health issues, about whole slew of things, patents, and in terms of intellectual property rights negotiations, in terms of enforcing those things, and also, so the latest, the round is not done. We're still in the Doha round. We keep having meetings. I think we had a Copenhagen meeting. The latest agreement to date, true date agreement, is the Bali package. And it was signed in 2013. So puts it into perspective, this kind of large negotiations. And I have 2 arguments for why I think this is lasting so long. One is because we're up to 159 countries. And so we have so many people at the negotiating table. 2, we had a major global recession during that time. And so during periods of global recession and in times of economic downturns, we're probably not trying to facilitate free trade, because even if it's good for your country, or even if it's going to help bring kind of the world out of this this recession that we were in at the time, even if it was, as a leader, I was likely to get more support if I moved into protectionist or nationalistic types of policies. And so it's the same way of this, like, this, hey, I want to move into this, like, I don't want to say that because I don't like that. This our country first type of mentality of this nationalism during that time was like, hey, we're not signing any agreement because there's, they're cheating us out of things where they might not have been, or we had already made those concessions. And part of the other arguments that have been happening during this Doha round is moving China from consider this, because we give these types of concessions to low-income countries, and we're moving to this like, hey, you don't kind of get to be considered a low-income country anymore because you have this huge developed and they still have low income, so it's not to say that they don't. It's that they have also, they're functioning as this upper class as well. Is that they are making part of the low income is that they can tap their currency to somebody else's currency, which is an argument that we're going to talk about later when we get into currency and foreign investment. But it distorts trade, and it distorts how trade flows can move. And so when we start thinking about things like that, that's part of those concessions that are the discussions that are happening during the Doha round, which is, I think, will continue to be go for a while. And I definitely don't think Doha is going to finish while we are in a world pandemic. So I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. So I'm going to move on, and we're going to go back to this GATT and the Uruguay round and what it established. Are there any questions on kind of rounds of GATT up until this point. I didn't go over all of them. I can send you a link. Wikipedia has a thing and talks about the different rounds, and you could look through what concessions were made at the time. In order to find individual concessions, you'd have to like really dig because there's thousands of pages worth of information. But are there any questions before we move on?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I was trying to look at like who was involved in like the Doha round and all that whenever I was making my outline, but I could not find, like I looked and looked and I could not find like anything that said exactly who was part of it.
Yeah, I would have to also look for the full list. It's going to be whoever is associated with the WTO. So it's going to be the WTO countries at this point. And so those should be then, if you look at the WTO countries, those are all the people who can have a seat at the Doha roundtable. And now whether they're choosing to negotiate, but being part of the WTO means that you're going to be bound by the agreement. So maybe that would be a better way to look, is what I'm getting at, if you look for WTO countries.
Oh, okay.
Are there any other questions? Nope. Okay. So I wanted to kind of jump. I know we're jumping around. Jump around. So we had this GATT. It was helped to establish this kind of settlement of trade disputes, but again, it didn't have any enforcement. So even when it came out and said, "Hey, you're cheating," and you got to stop that, there was no real way. There was no enforcement behind it. There was no real way to like force them to. And so, which is what the WTO was created. And so the difference was the WTO is an organization. And so, yeah, we'll talk about WTO, and then we're going to come back to some more of the things that happened during Uruguay round. So the WTO, let's briefly talk about that. WTO is an organization. It's headquartered. Does anybody know where it's headquartered?
Geneva, Switzerland.
Yeah. Quartered in Geneva, Switzerland. I had a friend who worked for the WTO for a little bit. He's an international lawyer, and so he used to tell me things. It was quite interesting to hear the work he worked on, or the kind of negotiation, because he was doing this. There's this thing about how we make these agreements and the wording that we put into them, and so he was studying how different phrases were developed throughout the history of these different agreements and how those are changing between countries. And so kind of how we're choosing to kind of legally bind ourselves and how that wording works. It was kind of in a nerdy way. It was interesting. The WTO is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. It deals with trade of goods like GATT, but it also deals with commercial services. So trade of goods, but it also deals with commercial services. Intellectual property, and foreign investment. And the idea behind this is that it's not just focused on, so GATT was really just focused on tariffications, tariffs and trade, right? It was really just the movement of goods across between countries. WTO came along and said, hey, part of the Uruguay round was, hey, trade is not just goods moving anymore. We also have services, we have banking, we have all of these other things. We have investments moving around, we have commercial services, we have intellectual property, and we need to have some organization that's going to be able to enforce rules against those. That if we all come together and says, as a world or as all of our member countries, that we need to have some kind of mechanization for allowing for retaliation, and we need to be able to justify that retaliation. So the idea behind that was when we did without, the U.S.-China trade war we just had, right, where we unfairly put, tariffs on China, and China said, hey, went to WTO, and WTO says, yep, that's, it's fair, you can retaliate. And so they were allowed to retaliate. We can't retaliate from their retaliation, because any retaliation we had against them was also retaliatable. And so that's part of the WTO is this kind of, what's the meme of, it's the actor, and he used to be Dr. Kim Jong or something, and he's like, I'll allow it, and he's got like the Fiesta hat on. He's like, I'll allow it. Basically, the WTO is that guy. I will allow it, or no, you can't do that. I wish I had the meme in front of me, and I'll be like, this is the guy. I think you all get it. I've seen a few smiley faces. Anyways, the WTO also is moving from a big decoupling, so they pushed for decoupling payments or policies to production. So, when we talked about this kind of the stoplight approach, and we talked about how blue policies were supposed to be decoupled from production, that's a pretty new policy. I mean, we're talking, when did I just say Uruguay had 87 months from 1986. So I don't know the year of that. Effectively, whenever it was signed, that's when we said, hey, we got to start decoupling our payments from production, because they're trade distorting. Because what we've done is we've just kind of subsidized people to produce when they shouldn't be producing. And so the WTO said, hey, let's push for this. The aim was to reduce trade distortions. And so that's not just because of tariffs, right? It was also because of these non-tariff trade barriers. And so we're going to talk in just a second about the ways in which during the Uruguay round and with the creation of the WTO that we reduced a lot of those points of pain, or those kind of non-tariff trade barrier points that people were using as trade barriers, but they were doing it with kind of this, I don't have a tariff, right? One of the other things was GATT was super slow and long process to negotiate any type of a trade dispute. So GATT was slow on trade disputes because they had to have, GATT had a big thing where you had to form a committee, and so then it had to go to the committee member countries, and then you had to go gather all the data, and then had to be sent back. And part of it is by the time that the GATT came to a conclusion, even if they said you were wrong, this was years later, and you were like, okay, well, now I can retaliate, and people had already retaliated, and so there was all of this kind of, it was too slow and too cumbersome to move, and so WTO is faster. WTO faster, more agile. It created a dispute panel. So instead of having to create these groups every time somebody had a dispute, they say, hey, listen, we're going to have just a reigning dispute panel, and there'll be members who kind of flow in and flow out. We'll have different people in there, but anytime somebody has a dispute, it immediately goes here, and it can come, and so resolutions can happen a lot faster. We can make a decision a lot quicker and say, hey, no, you defied WTO rules, or you didn't, right? And a country can no longer block the panel's final decision. So remember that escape clause we talked about it yesterday, and GATT said, hey, you can have an escape clause, and you're like, I tap out, I'm just going to do my thing anyway. Basically, countries who were, a panel during GATT said, hey, you cheated, and they're like, oh, escape clause, never mind, I'm going to do my own thing. And so what happened was you had no enforcement. And here they said, listen, once it gets to this point, you're bound by what the WTO says. You can't tap out. And one of the things, if you're curious question, because I feel like you should have, if you didn't, here's a question you might want to think about, is, well, why do people join the WTO? Why are they part of it if they, because now they're having to be held by the rules of everybody. And part of the reason is because you're getting all of the benefits of the trade between these countries, because you're getting the benefit of somebody enforcing your rules. So let's say that the US, we create a lot of intellectual property. Let's say that we said, you know what? We don't want to be part of the WTO anymore. We don't like the rules. They're not helping us at all. And so we jump out. Nobody has to enforce our intellectual property rules anymore. Nope. Everybody can come steal all of our intellectual property rights. What are we going to do? We have no international body to go to fight for us because we're not part of them anymore. Right? So that's part of one of the ideas is being part of this kind of cooperation between all these countries is that now there's some kind of enforcement to say, hey, you can't take Windows and use it in the I always pick on China, and I don't mean to, but we've had some poor relationship with China. In the mid 2000s, there was a big deal in the news for a while because they realized that the Chinese government were using pirated versions of Microsoft Office. And it was this big like trade deal that they came in and they were going to buy legitimate versions of Microsoft Office to use in their government. And it was like goodwill to say, hey, listen, because, you know, we're going to be part of this WTO. We want to make sure that we're all on the up and up. And so it was this movement towards understanding and defending kind of intellectual property rights. And so that's what the WTO does. And so when we have this idea of like, we got to get out, we don't need these rest of the people in the world, we'll just be America by ourselves. I mean, you know, I'm sure we could produce a lot of things ourselves and we could go without a lot of things. But one of the values that we have as WTO is having some other entity to be able to go to and to help justify our actions and get something. Also, we have favored trade between people, and if we no longer have that favored trade, it becomes an issue. So, I have one more thing. The WTO now has 164 members. So when I gave you that number of members who were arguing for Doha was 159, I think that number was listed prior to all of these members joining. Because again, it probably started with 159 in 2001, but there's continuously countries jumping on the WTO. The latest members, or the newest members, I guess, are Liberia and Afghanistan. And those are in 2018. Or that I saw anyways. So talking about WTO and member countries, 164 now. I think that there are 100 and, I was gonna say 190 and something else, but I actually don't. Anyways, I have to think about the total number of countries in the world, but this is also part of the reason why we're continuously having this, why it's going to keep getting longer and longer, because we have larger numbers of people debating about it. Are there any questions about the WTO? We're going to go back to some of the other things that fit into this intellectual trade, these non-tariff decoupling payments and this kind of non-tariff trade barriers as part of the Uruguay round. But does anybody have any questions about the WTO before we move to that? Again, I can't see all of your faces, and so I need to have like some kind of like, no, I'm good. Chat.
We're good.
Hey, thank you, Nate. I appreciate it. Oh, there's a chatty box. That was also helpful. Thanks, Riley. Okay, so we're going to go back to this Uruguay round. So part of the Uruguay round was this 10-year phase out of all ag subsidies. So back to Uruguay. Round. So, and again, part of this is the WTO. So it's Uruguay/WTO, and it's, but it's a 10-year phase out. Of coupled ag policies. So we talked about this WTO said, hey, we got to decouple everything. And it was, you were given 10 years, that 10 years is up now. There are still countries who have that, have a few amber box policies. Because remember, we were supposed to be stopping them, and they justify them using those, it's a protected product or some kind of negotiation in that framework. There's also a import barrier 10-year phase out. So we have these kind of tariffs, or we have these direct, limitations on trade, and also import barriers. So this isn't just, quotas or subsidy programs. This is also barriers to entry. They're saying, so there were countries who said, hey, there's a quota at the border, right? That's not a tariff. That just says I'm only going to accept a certain amount. And we're supposed to reduce these kind of import barriers or these direct quota systems and move to tariff rate quota systems, which is what most countries have gone to. So like I'm just going to, the cap uses tariff rate quota systems in terms of importing certain goods. One of the big things, and it's interesting to me because that's my research, is the harmonization. So this was a big one, is the harmonization of health and sanitary regulation. So we talked about our non-tariff trade barriers earlier in the semester. What were the big things we talked about?
Sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions.
Yeah, so we talked about sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions, and those are basically restrictions used to protect human, animal, and plant health. And so those are protections that we say, hey, we're going to do this for health reasons. But what if I just use my example of China? I know I keep picking on China. If I could think of another really good example, my example of China and the BSE incident where they said, hey, we're not going to import your beef. 15 years later, and you're like, okay, but that's not BSE anymore. That's just you not wanting to import our beef, right? And so that's that's an issue with like this kind of harmonization. And so part of the agreement during Uruguay, and this is part of the reason why China had to start saying, hey, we'll import your beef, but it has to be they created all these other restrictions in the name of going by sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions, is that that it has to be based on they now have to be based on internationally agreed standards. So it's not always going to be perfect. We're going to have people who are going to use stricter standards, or we're going to have people who make up their own rules and standards, but there has to be some kind of internationally agreed standards. So you can't say so China got around it because they allowed beef to come in, but they put such strict, but what they did was they had other standards in terms of importing beef from the US. And that standard, it made it costly, and it basically became prohibitive for US beef to come in. Also, we just shipped a lot of beef to Hong Kong, and then it went to the rest of China. So there was a work around the system. For the rest of this says that we have to kind of go by these international standards. So we made this agreement on, I'm not going to write it all out because it's really long. It's agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Basically, we created a set of multilateral rules. And those are through different organizations. That's going to be through something like I have it written down, the International Office of Epizoonotics for Animal Health, which is the OIE. It's the kind of the Office of the World Health Organization. It's going to be the Office of International Plant Protection Convention for Plant Health. And so basically there are these kind of global entities now that are determining what is internationally recognized as good practices and standards for human, animal, and plant health, and those are what we're going to base our rules on. And so if we wanted to create some kind of trade dispute with China, and we say, hey, they're using some kind of standard that's not internationally recognized, we could win that, right? If we said that their standard is that cows have to be tested 55 times before they can come in, that's not an internationally agreed on amount of testing. Right? Because if internationally agreed, we say you should be tested 6 times, and that's that is more an abundant amount to know whether something has a disease or not, then they can't have this kind of 55-person standard. Now, this is also different in terms of, because I know you're thinking plant health, what about GMOs and like the European Union? And if you weren't thinking that, well, here, that's a thought. I just gave it to you. The other thing we might think about is that countries can also choose they can still have their own rules and they can have their own standards. It is at what point that it becomes trade distorting and it becomes a barrier to trade. And if it does, then you can have a negotiation. You still have sovereignty. So you still have the ability to make rules. You're just supposed to follow these kind of international standards. Did somebody say something, or was that just my feedback? One of the other things you're supposed to have is this, you can still have the individual country can choose their own appropriate level of protection, as long as the guidelines take into account the object of minimizing negative trade effects. So the idea is you as a country can make whatever rules you want. You as a country can establish your rules. You can create harsher standards. But if at some point if you're creating these rules as barriers to trade and it can be traced back to that and somebody creates a dispute on you, they can have retaliatory tariffs. Now, if we came in and said, hey, you created this thing and it slightly inconveniences me, we're not going to win that trade dispute because that's not legitimate, because they can create some trade effects. It's just as long as they're not trying to, is that they can show that they tried to minimize all negative trade effects, that they tried to make for free trade. And that's sometimes where you get into like the technicalities and why it's like a fine line between who's going to win in the country in terms of a trade dispute. Can't get those feedback from somebody saying something. Nope. Okay. So, yeah. What time is it? Oh my goodness. Is it the end of, no, class ends at 10:55. Let's have a break because I feel like we're at that.
Wait, you just said into class, so.
No, I said the class ends at 10:55, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I know, Justin. We might end early today. Maybe
I mean, you already said it. I'm just saying.
Like, I'm just getting off of here. I'm gonna watch your stupid video later. It's like this is the type of dense material where it's just like, all the definitions and all the talking, and it's less of like something where you can have fun graphs. I like graphs. I'm gonna say that. And I don't think we're gonna get into fun things for a bit, because it's all kind of it's the political things until we get back into, we're going to get into exchange rate system. Does somebody have something to say? I have crazy news. Does anybody have crazy news? No.
I saw that an indigenous person from like the Amazon, like one of their tribe members has got the corona. And they're like the first one, and so they're pretty concerned that's like going to be the end of them.
Oh, that's terrible. How did did they come into contact with people, or?
They said like their plans to reduce it are like to reduce contact from outsiders. So like I guess maybe it was someone traveling a while ago, but they also said that it could be like it was in the water supply or like the river that came through the forest. So. Pretty tragic.
Yeah, that's terrible. That's rough.
Yeah.
And like the idea that it how it got to them. I didn't finish reading it. There's a book. What is it called? Guns, Germs, and Steel. And I think they did like a mini series on it. But it talks about like how do certain populations why did certain demographics live and not, and why did certain demographics like an argument between like the settlers who came into the U.S. versus the Native American populations who were already here, that we had this huge kind of, I think smallpox killed off a lot of the indigenous populations. It was this idea of like arguably the indigenous population should have survived, that they had the food, they had the resources, and you had these kind of like sick immigrants who came in who camped out, and like they were the ones. But the argument was that they brought these diseases that were not native to this area, and it kind of killed off some of the indigenous populations. And so it's this idea of how anyways, it's a anthropology. It's pretty dense though. I started reading it and I didn't get all the way through, but it's a take on like why certain populations have survived or not. And the argument with maybe these indigenous populations, or that, which is why it's super sad, is they haven't been exposed to the same diseases that we all have, right? Or that they don't have access to the same medical care that we all have. So that seems super crazy. Well, that's heavy. That's heavy, man. Does anybody have any other news? I mean, I also have not happy news, but I have other crazy news. Well, T-Mobile and Sprint are officially completing their merger. So I guess it's not sad news. That's if you have T-Mobile or Sprint, your service plans are going to expand because now you have a larger network. It's $26 billion. So if we think about, to Justin's point earlier, that's, 26 out of 300, whatever percentage that is, in terms of just the amount that T-Mobile and Sprint produce. Oh, and then the sad news is there's some petroleum companies who have filed for bankruptcy in the U.S. because of the plunges in oil prices. Because oil prices tanked, you saw these shell companies who were digging for oil in the U.S. Going bankrupt. So that's my crazy. Wimbledon's also canceled, just in case you wanted to know. I know you're all super excited about tennis right now. This is the thing that is keeping you going is tennis. Okay.
The last time the Olympics were in Tokyo, they were also canceled.
What?
It was during during World War II, and so Japan just elected to not host them anymore. So.
Oh, that's so sad. Like
yeah.
they're like, oh hey, we're gonna go ahead and do it now. It's been enough time. Oh, poor Tokyo.
I think it's also not been canceled. It's just been postponed. But yeah, I mean, it was World War II, and I mean they were like the Axis at the time, so how bad do you feel? Still.
Yeah, like legit, but wow, that's.
Last time Wimbledon was canceled too, right?
Was it really?
Yeah, it was World War II.
See, learning new things all the time.
Yeah.
Learning new things. Yeah, that's craziness. I have nothing. I'm gonna respond to this thing over here. It's a private chat. Let me respond to this. Okay. Okay. In the interest of getting Justin out of here early today, because he's out here fighting for everybody. Okay, let me look at my calendar really quick. We have basically 2 weeks left. Okay, Justin, you probably will get out here a little early today. So, we are going to finish this section on Uruguay, and it's good. We're going to define what tariffication is, and then we're going to stop for the day because next time we'll come back and we'll talk about multilateral trade agreements. So one of the final things we're going to talk about today is this thing called tariffication. And this was an effort to change non-tariff trade barriers into equivalent tariffs, then reduce them. So the idea up until this point is we have these kind of non-tariff trade barriers, this kind of just rules on like, we want something from you and not you, these kind of just arbitrary rules. and to say, okay, let's put them into a tariffication. Let's make them into actual tariffs, and then you have to reduce them, right? Because the idea was to push for free trade, and is to get rid of, the aim was to get rid of hidden trade barriers. So we have these kind of hidden barriers to trade, and so let's get rid of those and then try to reduce the formal ones. And so this required that people try to understand what the equivalencies of those were. And the hard part is how do you define an equivalent tariff, right? If I'm arbitrarily saying I'm going to give, like, it's like grading your homework and being like, I'm just arbitrarily going to give you 5 points or 2 points, and I'm just going to make that choice. And then you're going to ask me to create a rubric for you. And it's like, well, I don't know. I'm coming up with some mental rule, right? It's very hard for me to figure out, like, what is a rubric when I'm just arbitrarily picking grades. So the same thing happens is people were arbitrarily doing these trade barriers. And sometimes those trade barriers were due to something like domestic production. Oh, production's down, and we need to, or production's up and we need to help protect our prices. And so they were just kind of arbitrarily making policies. And so how do you create an equivalent tariff associated with that? Because a policy that you're not supposed to have anyway. And so there was a little bit of this, it's not straightforward, it's hard to work through, it's hard to negotiate. And so sometimes that they were having to be created based on the basis of prices between two countries. So they were having to say, like, hey, how are these prices different? And that difference in prices being shipped and moved is because of some kind of hidden trade barrier. And so you're going to have to, like, create a tariff that's associated with that and then reduce it. And so what it did was it led to movement toward, and we already mentioned this kind of tariff rate quotas. So people had these kind of quotas, but they weren't formalized, and then they were not, and we're supposed to move away from quotas. And then people had these kind of tariff systems that weren't formalized, but it was a way to say, hey, we're going to bring something in. And so the kind of consensus around the world was a way to continue to be allowed to protect your country, in moving away from these kind of non-tariff trade barriers, was that we'll create some kind of formal tariff rate system so that we can step people in. Because remember, it's that, it's a bar steppy thing for tariff rate quotas, so that, like, you can ship in at different tariff rates up until certain quantities. So maybe this is the tariff rate, and these are quantities. And so your tariff rate is going to go up as our quantities go up, and it's going to be flat until a certain quantity. And once they hit that quantity, we're going to jump up to a next tariff rate quota. And effectively what it does is it reduces imports, or reduces your exports to my country. And so there was a big movement towards these. And so that's why you see a lot of formalization about these tariff rates around the world. And so I imagine when you're looking at your countries, you're going to see things about different tariff rate quotas. I did a project once in, I think I talked about my rice trade with the European Union, and looked at the tariff rate quotas in terms of, they have a different tariff rate quota for brown rice and for white rice and for milled rice. And so just, there's just different the ways we protect different products. That is basically it for what we're going to talk about for the different rounds of GATT and the WTO. We're going to move into, not that we're done with the WTO, just they carry on throughout the rest of the semester, for the rest of our class. But next class, we'll talk about trade agreements, and then we'll get into foreign direct investment and currency markets. So we're done for the day, Justin, if you want to hop off. But if anybody has any questions or you have any discussion, please let me know. If not, you're free to go. Enjoy your weekend. Hopefully it's going to be 70s, right? So that's going to be nice. So, and for the rest of you who's coming to my class later, I'll see you in like.
Hi, Dr. Thompson.
Yes.
So we have to submit the summary or introduction today.
Yes, if you can submit that, it was supposed to be turned in before class, but if you can turn it in after class, that'd be great.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Stop sharing. Are there any other questions? Nope. Okay. Well, it was lovely to see your faces or to hear from you. And I'll see y'all later. I guess I'll end it for everybody.